Hey man, how's it going? Doing another video lesson for you. So last time we talked a lot about our kind of 5 pentatonic shapes that we could go through. Today I want us to take a little bit and I want us to kind of focus in on major and minor and talk about how we can find chords coming out of those. We're going to stick with the same the same major and minor scale we were using last time. So we're going to use E minor and G major, right? But instead of using them as pentatonic scales, we're going to be using them as full scales, right? Remember, penta, basically you can think about pentagon, pentagrams, right? It just means 5, right? We're using 5 notes in a scale. These are really good for kind of getting used to understanding how we can play different scale shapes going up and down our neck, and that's kind of what we talked about last time. But for today, right, how do we take one of those scales and use that to kind of help us figure out what chords that we have, right? So first things first, right? Let's just go through our musical alphabet. Remember, it's A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. In between A and B, there's A sharp. The only 2 notes that don't have sharps in between them are B and C and E and F, right? Then we'd have C sharp right here, D sharp right here, F sharp right here, and G sharp right here. Remember, anything that we're calling a sharp right now, we could call A sharp B flat as well. It's just a difference of whether we're moving up or down. That'll be something that we'll talk about when we talk about our circle of fifths, which will probably be next time. I want to go over modes and kind of the circle of fifths and how we can use that. But for this, right, when we're playing E minor, right, remember there's kind of 2 patterns that we want to remember whenever we're using full scales, right? And these both relate to us playing our major scale, and we're going to talk about how we can kind of use them for minor as well. But 2 patterns that we want to remember whenever we're playing something major, right? The first one, right, is we want to remember the spacing of all of the notes, right? So how far apart or how many notes up do we go each time, all right? So the first one right here, right, would be us going for a major scale would be whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, right? Going through this, right? Remember what this is talking about, right, is helping us understand how we're going to move between the notes, right? So if we have E right here and we go up a whole step, right, we end up at F sharp, right? Or actually, technically, we're playing, this would be for G major, right? We'll come back to this part in a second, right? But yeah, so technically, if we're playing E minor, G major is our counter one, so we're going to start from G, that's my bad, but right, if we have G right here and we go up a whole step from G, we end up at A, right? If we go up a whole step from A, we end up at B. If we go up a half step from B, we end up at C. If we go up a whole step from C, we end up at D. If we go up a whole step from D, we end up at E. If we go up a whole step from E, we end up at F sharp. And then if we go up one more from F sharp, we end up back at G, right? And this is kind of the spacing that we have for all of these notes. Keep in mind, these 2 scales that we're going to use for major and minor, right, are going to be the same, right? We're just going to start them from different places, right? So for our E minor scale, right, we're going to start our E minor one from right here, right? So the pattern we would have in turn for a minor scale would be this, right? So all we're going to do is we're just going to start from E right here, right? So if E's our first note, we're going to go a whole step and a half step, and then a whole step, and a half step, and then a whole step and a whole step, right? This is the same grouping of notes. If we go up a whole step from E, we end up at F sharp. From there we go to G. From there, a whole step up from G would be A, a whole step up from A would be B, half step from B would be C, a whole step from C would be D, a whole step from D would be E, right? And we went through our whole scale, right? The other pattern we want to remember that's going to be relating to these, right? We're going to start with the major one just because the major one's the one you're going to hear all the time. It's going to be this. Major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished. And we'll talk about what a diminished chord is in a second, right? And then once we get back here, right, we're just back to the top. Right, remember, this is the whole pattern that we're looking at right there, right? 7 notes long. Anytime we're playing full scales on guitar, we're playing patterns that are 7 notes. Same thing right here, right? All we're doing when we're playing this is we're adding it. It's a minor scale, so obviously we're going to start on minor. So we're going to go minor, diminished, major, minor, minor, major, major, and then right here we'd be back to minor. But this is the whole pattern that we're looking at, right? So what are these for, right? Remember, as we go through our scales, right, when we go from major to minor, right, if we go from E major and we move up to G and start playing the same notes, we end up playing our minor scale, or our major scale, right? Keep in mind, these two patterns are us just starting in different places, right? If we want to find this one right here, major diminished, or minor diminished major, minor, minor, major, major, right? We can just go to our major scale pattern. We can just start from E, right? Minor, diminished, major, minor, minor, major, major, and then right here we'd be back to D. Same thing over here, right? If we wanted to play our major scale pattern, right, we would just start here from G, right? We'd go major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, right? We can take this process and we can move this to different places. For example, right, like before this, we were talking about A Dorian, right? If we wanted to find the pattern or the spacings we would want for A Dorian, right, we would just start on A, right? Same thing with B Phrygian, same thing with D Mixolydian, right? Just taking this pattern and following it up our scales, right? So, how can we kind of use these, right? So, remember, whenever we're talking about a scale, right, we talk about it in a very specific way because all of our scales work together in the same way, right? And the way we talk about it basically is just numbering it 1 to 7. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The reason why we talk about them in numbers and not specifically what notes they are is because, remember, our scales are relative, right? So if we take our A minor scale, right, and we move it up, everything up 1 note, right, that scale is still going to function the same, right? But we're going to be using a completely different grouping of notes. We'll be playing A sharp minor, right? The rules that we're going to be using in that scale and how the notes relate to each other is going to stay the same, right? And this is the same with anywhere that you would put this scale, right? We could put it over E, right? And the way 1 interacts with 3 is going to be the same way as how 1 would interact with 3 if we were playing A or in G or whatever, right? The biggest thing is remembering our minor scale shape as we do this, right? So let's say we're talking about E minor right here, right? We would have E would be our 1 because it's the first one, right? F sharp would be 2 because it's the second note in our scale. G, A, B, C, D, right? So, something I think we've talked about a little bit before, right, is how we make chords out of notes, right, and how we can bind these notes together to make different things, right? So, the beauty of this little trick right here, right, is any scale or any chord that we make is going to be made out of 3 things, right? If we only want it to be major or minor, and we can add some other things to it, and we'll talk about that in 1 second. This will kind of have to do with being diminished. But let's say we want to find our E minor scale, right? There are kind of 3 things we want to look for. We want to make sure that we have E, right? So we want to have our note E, right? From there, we want to go 2 notes up. So we want to go from 1, 2, 3. We want to go to the 3rd note in our scale, right? Anytime we're playing the 3rd note in a scale, we're playing something called either our major 3rd or our minor 3rd, right? They're always a half step apart, right? All this does is changes a chord from being a major chord to a minor chord, right? If we took E major and laid this over, we would find that G, right, instead of being G would be G sharp instead, right? But for that, we don't have to worry about that right now. We just know that we have to have G in this chord. And then from there, we need our 5th, right? The 5th you can think about as kind of like a perfect harmony, right? Or like, again, when we talk about the circle of 5ths, this will be something that we kind of go over. But, right, we would add our 5th into that, right? So if we wanted to play E minor, right, real quick, let me put our E minor scale right here for us. E, A, D, G, B, E. And then give me 1 second while I write this out. I'm going to change it a little bit because we're going to have to skip a note doing it in minor like this, but it would look like this. Remember, whenever we're playing a scale, we're not playing all of these notes as different things, right? What we're actually doing is just playing little patterns of 7, right? So right here we have the same scale. E, F sharp, G, A, B, C, D. Right, and then we could have the same thing going up here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Right, we'd have the same pattern right there, and then going on, onward, and so on, right? So, what we're doing right now, right, is just looking at this, and we're seeing all of these notes kind of put together. If we wanted to make an E major scale, right, the first thing that we want to do, right, is figure out where we're going to start, right, or what our lowest note's going to be, right? Traditionally, when we play a chord, we want the lowest note to be the root, but that isn't always true, right? You don't have to do that. As long as you get the 3 notes together, it's still technically the same. So, first things first, right? We know that this note right here, 0, is going to be E. We know we can play E right here on 2, right? We also know that we can play E a couple other places too. We can play E down here on the high E string right there as well, right? So we have 3 different places we can play E, right? From there, if we look for our 5th, right, or if we look for our 3rd, we can play our 3rd right here on the E string, 3 notes up. We can play our 3rd right here on just like open G, right? We can also play our 3rd down here at 3, right? Awesome. What about our 5th, right? We can play our 5th right here, right? We can also play our 5th right here, right? We can't really, those are kind of the only 2 places we can play our 5th right now. But, right, keep in mind, we can't play multiple notes on 1 string at the same time, so we're going to have to spread this out a little bit. So, let's say we're going to take our root right here. Let's say, you know, we're gonna make this chord weird, right? We're just going to take 1 of each, right? So, we know where can we play all 3 of these together. If we take the 5th from the A string, and the root from the D string, and the 3rd from the G string, we put these 3 notes together, we end up with this, right? So we end up with 2, 2, 0, right? Right here we're just playing E, G, or actually we're playing this, we're starting from G, so we're playing B, yeah, we're playing B, E, and then G, right? What we have right here is our E minor scale, or our E minor chord, right? Crazy. We can do this again too, like we can come down here, we can find just like we can take these 3, right? We could take our 3rd, our 5th, and our root. We could literally just play this, so we could go 0, 0, 0, right? So, how can we use this to kind of help us with these other chords, right? So right here, what we just played is E minor. Right here, we're playing basically, it would be G, B, E, right? But both of these would be different ways of us playing our E minor chord, right? Where this gets fun, right, is remembering how kind of our scales work from last time, right? So if we move up to D, right, or if we start this pattern just instead from not E, we start from G, right? So we start saying we're going to do this as a major scale, right? That is still a scale, right? That's our G major scale, right? If we start this pattern from G right there and go all the way through. So what that means, right, is if we're looking for a G major chord, right, all we have to do is change this pattern around a little bit, right? All we're going to do is instead of E being 1, right, like how it is for our E minor scale, we're going to take G and we're going to count that kind of as R1, right? So we're going to go from G and we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And now we have the same building blocks that we're looking for as for E minor, right? Remember, anytime we're playing a chord, right, it's built out of 3 things. It's built out of our root, our 3rd, and our 5th, right? So our root, our 3rd, and our 5th for G major would be G, B would be the 3rd, and D would be the 5th, right? So going through this, a couple places we could do this, right, is we could do this right here. So if we take G from the E string, B from the A string, and then D from the D string, right? We end up with this. This right here would just be our G major chord, right? Or we're just using those 3 notes for G major, right? We're literally going G, B, D, right? So from there, we could do the same thing again. If we go down here, we could take like G, B, D, or yeah, how can we play D? We could play it a little differently, but if we take, oh yeah, if we do this, we're still playing G. So we can do this, right? And this is still us playing D, D, G, B, right? All these would be called our little triads, right? Remember, this would be us playing E minor, and this would be us playing G major. But let's say we wanted to find like F sharp. So we know if we look over here to F sharp, we know F sharp's diminished. Diminished just means that your 5th is going to be a half step down, right? Diminished chords sound really like funky, so that probably wasn't the greatest example. But like, what about like A, right? If we go back to this pattern, we find A, right? We know A is going to be a minor chord, right? So we go back here, we're going to make A 1, so we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We know that A is 1, we know that C is 3, we know that E is 5, right? We just go back into this scale, we look, okay, we know A is right here, we can play A right here, and then we find the next one that we need. We know that we're going to need E, so we're going to find 2 right there. And then again, right, we're going to go down here, we find A again right here, right? And then again, we could find our root right here, we can find our 5th right here, right? And we could make like an A minor chord. But this is a process we do a lot. This is very music theory-y, right? To use that in a silly way. But we'll talk more about this. This is something, don't be afraid to ask questions, right? The more you ask questions about this and the more you investigate it, there's a saying that I like. It's kind of, I think it's by Neil deGrasse Tyson, but it's the more you learn about the subject, the further you find that you are from understanding all of it, right? This is going to be something like that, right? Where the more time that you sit with this idea of how scales kind of interact with each other and how we can find different chords and how different chords work with each other, right? You're going to find things that you have questions about. You're going to find things that you want to like understand better. And that's the best way to learn guitar theory, right? Is not getting told things, but asking questions, right? So take this as kind of a jumping off point, right? And let yourself kind of explore this idea, right? Try using this idea over a couple different chords, try it over different scales, stuff like that. But for right now, I'm gonna leave you with that, and I'll see you next time. Right, try changing the key of this a little bit. Let's make sure you have a good shot of the board and everything. And then if you have any questions, please just let me know. All right, later.